Right, good morning. Thank you very much. Kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be back in Belgium again. I've been here many times over the years, but this seems to be a very remarkable, unusual, very interesting conference. And my colleague Waldo and I were very pleased to be invited and to come and join you. Can I just check you a little bit? How many of you would say that you're here primarily as mental health professionals? Can you just put your hands up? Yeah. How many of you are people who've actually used mental health services, or maybe have a family member or a friend who's used mental health services? Very good, great. And how many of you are the creative types, the artists and the engineers and the designers? Yeah. Well, you're all creative, I know. That's great, thank you very much. It gives me a bit of a feeling. I'm going to talk, and Chantal said yesterday, I'm going to talk really about the importance of accessing social roles, particularly around housing and employment, but also social integration, tackling the problems of stigma, which are ubiquitous really across mental health services. And that's because of course it's through occupying social roles that we build our social networks, and it's through our social networks that we relieve our sense of loneliness and being alone in the world. However, before I begin, I just have to make an apology. Okay, I won't say anything more about that, but I felt I should say that before we begin. And before the tent gets blown down, but anyway. Okay. I've worked in mental health services, and I've had a family member with mental health problems for more than 30 years. And my rather sad conclusion after spending a lot of time in mental health services is that, and this is a quote from Tolstoy, who was a great, very idealistic social reformer, and he's saying here about social reform, he's saying, I sit on a man's back, choking him and making him carry me, and yet I assure myself and others that I'm very sorry for him, and I wish to ease his lot in all possible ways, except of course by getting off his back. Now that is a rather sad conclusion, I have to admit, after many years in mental health services, but I'd like to begin to explain to you why I think it's appropriate, and in particular the way in which we go about organising and delivering mental health services. I think in general terms, as it were, the aim of mental health services is, most people would think of it as applying treatments of various kinds in order to reduce distress so that people can then get on with their lives. And that sounds fine. That's a kind of medical model. You treat the symptoms. Once the symptoms get better, then by some obscure and rather magical process, the person is able then to pick up their lives and live their lives again. However, the research evidence now suggests that that kind of model is rather doubtful when it comes to describing what actually happens in mental health services. The wheels are beginning to come off the traditional treatment and cure model, and here we have a chap driving along in his car with the wheels coming off. If I begin at the top with diagnosis and work round. There's a lot of debate nowadays about the role of diagnosis, which is a fundamental medical process, and how it applies within mental health problems. The symptoms of different conditions don't actually seem to hang together as well as they should do if diagnosis was working very well. And what's more, they don't actually seem to predict outcomes in a way that they would in a traditional physical condition. There's been a lot of work, as I'm sure you're all aware, on the genetics of mental health problems, as in the genetics of many other conditions. And I think it's fair to say that the research on genetics shows only one thing, and that is that it's much more complicated than we might have thought at the beginning. And severe mental health problems have got very complicated genetics, and the notion that we'll somehow be able to pick out the gene and slice it out or design a treatment that will just sort it out from a genetic point of view is a very, very long way away. There are problems with medication. I don't know whether many of you are currently taking medications, but you probably know that there's quite a lot of controversy now about what's really going on with the effectiveness of the medications that are used in mental health. Both those are used for the short term and in the longer term. In the short term, there's a lot of questioning now about how much of the effects of medication are due to the medication and how much are due to people's expectations that the medication is going to work. And in the long term, there is a lot of very worrying evidence accumulating about the long-term effects of medication, and whether they really help people or whether actually they get in the way of people getting better. And Waldo mentioned yesterday this very, very worrying research that people who are along very long-term medication, 20 or 30 years, die earlier than people as were not on the medication.
Sorry, the microphone is just a little bit in the wrong direction. This will be
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that better? Speak louder, he says. Okay, that's easy for me. I'll just shout. So both in the short term and in the long term, there are real questions about medication, and I think, not in my career now, but for young mental health professionals starting, I think we'll see a different approach to medication, actually a much more cautious use of medication, particularly in the long term, than we've seen up to now. In the same way, there's also evidence really beginning to accumulate that psychological treatments, which everybody thought a few years ago was going to be effective, particularly a treatment known as CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. There's some new evidence really which questions whether CBT is as effective as we thought it was, because people have done research looking at the effectiveness of CBT over the past 10, 15 years in different controlled trials, different studies. And they find that its effectiveness appears to be reducing over time. Now, that shouldn't happen. It shouldn't be becoming less effective just over time. That's what happens with drugs. Drugs always become less effective over time. So the drug companies then manufacture a new drug, and then it becomes more effective, and then the same process happens. And the suggestion is that maybe some of the effectiveness of psychological treatments is due to the fact that they were new, but now everybody's got used to them and they're not perhaps working quite as well. There is a continual problem which has been present in mental health services since people recognised them as separate conditions, that some people just simply don't get better. Some people are left with residual symptoms and so on, and I think Chantal mentioned this yesterday. And for them, the model of treatment, which views mental health problems as though they were an infection or an acute appendix or something like that, and people had to take the treatment, then they would get better, that model doesn't seem to work. It's much more like the management of a long-term condition which fluctuates but doesn't kind of ever get completely better. There's also been a lot of debates, and Waldo, I think, hinted at this yesterday, about who is in charge of this process, who has the knowledge and who has the power. And the growth of a movement which recognizes the expertise of people who've had mental health problems as well as people who've studied mental health problems, that's very important, I think, in challenging the traditional assumptions about power and knowledge and so on. And then finally, and this is what I'm going to come back to, this evidence about the importance of social factors and their influence on outcomes and the importance of stigma. So I'm going to go on and talk about that now. This is a book by an epidemiologist called Michael Marmot, who's very well known in England. He's advised government and so on, and has been interested all his career in the influence of social factors on health outcomes. And he's shown particularly that poverty, employment, and social integration have very powerful effects on health outcomes in ways which are inexplicable if you just consider people's symptoms. You have to look at them in their social context. And what Marmot has shown particularly is that in terms of poverty, it's inequalities in wealth that are most important. And those countries which have the highest inequalities are the ones where, as it were, the people at the bottom of the pile show the most adverse health outcomes. The same with employment. You know, we all think, those of us who are employed, we all think employment is terrible. But there's only one thing worse, than being employed, and that's not being employed. Actually, the effects of unemployment are much, much more serious than the stress that's associated with all our jobs, which is stressful, but actually it's also what makes them satisfying. Housing has been a strangely ignored area of mental health services. People think, well, we're mental health services. Why should we be interested in housing? But actually, we all have to live in houses. We all have to find somewhere to be in society. And it's true, to our shame as mental health professionals, that we've never paid that much attention to housing. And finally, this notion of control, which I'm going to talk about a bit more in a moment in relation to recovery ideas. And here there's a famous Indian economist called Amartya Sen, and he's worked a bit with Michael Marmot, and they have this idea that people's sense of control over their lives, none of us have perfect control over their lives, do we? But our sense of control is an important mediating factor between poverty and unemployment and poor housing. If you feel some sense of control over those processes, it's likely to be much better for you than if you feel no sense of control. So these social factors have now emerged as being at least as important as the symptoms themselves when it comes to people's health outcomes, particularly their mental health outcomes. And a lot of these ideas are incorporated into these notions which come under this heading of recovery. And, there's a lot of complicated stuff talked about recovery. And we've been working with colleagues, with service users and families. And in one of our sessions, one of the service users became rather exasperated by all these professionals arguing about definitions. And he said, look, it's very simple, actually. Recovery is about helping people live the lives they want to lead. That's all it is. And that is a very good summary. That is what recovery is about. And it's important, you can see there, that recovery is not about necessarily treating people's symptoms. Although if you can treat their symptoms, obviously that's a good idea. But it's primarily about helping people live the lives they want to lead. And the lives that people want to lead are all the same. You want somewhere decent to live that you have chosen and with people that you want to live with. You want a job that is satisfying for you, and you want to feel a part of your society. And it doesn't matter whether you're people who use services, mental health professionals, designers, businessmen, engineers. Those are very simple kinds of ideas that we all need to strive towards. So the key ideas in recovery, and Waldo talked about these a lot yesterday, these notions about hope. You have to have some hope about being able to realize your goals. You have to have some sense of control to be able to move towards them, and then you have to have the opportunities. And these simple ideas of hope, control, and opportunity are very powerful when you apply them to mental health services. If you think about the old mental hospitals, which is where I began working, the patients in the old mental hospitals had very little hope of ever getting out. They had very little control over their lives. They sometimes didn't even have control over the clothes that they wore, the food that they ate, the people that they interacted with. And they had very little opportunities to realize their hopes, give them a sense of control and move forward. So these ideas of hope, control and opportunity, they give us a way of examining mental health services and saying to people, well, you think you're providing a good mental health service, okay? Is it or is it not promoting people's sense of hope? Is it or is it not encouraging their sense of control? Is it or is it not giving them opportunities to live a life beyond illness? And those are very testing questions when you start to apply them to mental health services. And they're very testing partly because they put people's hopes around their social goals at the center of the process. And they also put mental health services in a different role. It puts them in a role of needing to collaborate with other agencies like housing, like employment, like social integration, and take mental health services beyond their traditional focus on treating people's symptoms. And at the heart of this process, and again, Waldo mentioned yesterday, is this notion of co-production. And co-production is a very powerful idea. It came into thinking about public services in England through some work that was done in America by a sociologist called Eleanor Alstrom. And she was asked by the Chicago Police Department why the Chicago Police Department was rather ineffective in controlling crime in Chicago. And Alstrom and her colleagues looked at the working of the Chicago Police Department, and they came back with the answer, well, the problem is that you, the Chicago Police Department, think that you're the only people in Chicago who are interested in controlling crime. You think it's your job and your activities are going to be what's going to be important. Whereas when you look at crime in Chicago, you see a lot of people who are actually interested in controlling crime. Shopkeepers, businessmen, members of the public, neighbours. And in many cases, the criminals themselves are interested in controlling crime. Not always, but I do most of my work now in prison, and I'm very familiar with prison and prison life. And most prisoners, not all, but most prisoners don't want to be in prison. They want to be outside living a decent life. So what Alan Alstrom was saying to the Chicago Police Department is you must see yourself in context, and you must see yourself working with these other people, including the criminals themselves, to find better ways of controlling crime. And that's what co-production is about. Co-production sees people like Waldo, who showed this so well yesterday, as part of the solution to the problem, not just the problem. And this is a very different way of thinking. We're so used to believing, there's a problem over there, we'll sort it out, rather than seeing, as it were, the problem as part of the solution. And so co-production is about professionals and service users and family members working together, not to do the same old things, but to do different things together, to create new services, to deliver those new services together, as in the recovery colleges that Waldo was talking about, and indeed to evaluate them together. And this notion about working together, co-production, is at the heart, I think, of these recovery ideas. Now, this is not just a lot of airy-fairy, sociological stuff. The World Health Organization has now made recovery a central organizing principle in mental health services. And you can see they say that recovery means gaining and retaining hope, understanding one's abilities and disabilities, engagement in an active life, and personal autonomy, social identity, meaning and purpose. And recovery is not synonymous with cure. And the core requirements for services to support recovery are listening and responding to individuals' understanding of their condition, what helps them make them recover, and working with people as equal partners in care. And peer workers, who I'm going to come on to in just a minute, they provide encouragement and a sense of belonging in addition to their expertise, and they're crucial to this process. How am I doing for time? Yeah. Okay. Having said what recovery is, it may be important to say what recovery isn't. So recovery is not based on a kind of notion that you have to cure everybody's symptoms so that they can then recover. It's not a version of anti-psychiatry. It's not against traditional treatments, but it provides a way of moving forward when traditional treatments don't work as well as you might hope. It's not an approach which says, as it were, the patients are all now in charge. It's an approach which says we must enter into a dialogue with the people that we're working with and find a way forward together. As I said, I work in prison a lot, and sometimes I encounter prisoners and I say, what are your hopes for the future? And they may say, well, when I'm out of prison, I expect I'll go back to selling drugs, outside the local primary school. Well, that's not a hope, a goal, which I can really support as a professional. We have to find, well, are there other ways in which you can make money? Can we find some other way forward? So it's not a case of sort of saying, well, now, as it were, the patients are in charge. It's a case of trying to set up a constructive dialogue. And recovery and hope. Recovery is not something that staff can do to patients. Staff can't make patients recover. Only patients can make patients. Only, as it were, you can pursue your own recovery. What staff can do is to try to help you with that process, and at the very least, not get in the way of it. And these ideas, these recovery ideas, of course, don't just apply in mental health, they apply, and this is what's happening now in the recovery colleges. Everybody have to hang on to the ceiling, I think. They apply to the management of physical conditions as well as mental health conditions. So this kind of turns the notion of mental health services upside down, and it says what we should be doing really is starting with people's goals, and those goals are mainly social goals, trying to help them with that, and then see what they need in terms of treatment. Because of course what you'll find is that if people are in good housing, if they have a little bit of money, if they are employed, if they feel a part of the community in which they live, then their symptoms will get better. Not all their symptoms are not completely better, but a lot better than if you try and treat people's symptoms when their social situation is very poor. So how can we do this? Well, the traditional way of approaching these problems in mental health services would be to take people in hospital, to treat them for a while, and then when you've run out of treatment options, you begin to rehabilitate them, which is to prepare them for life outside, and you start to work with people in hospital, and you put them into halfway houses and 3/4 way houses and 7/16 way houses, until eventually, if any of them survive, they get out into a real house in the community. And similarly with employment, you have sheltered workshops and you train people and you give them interview practice and all the rest of it. Now, the problem with that approach, and I've been involved in this myself, so I know what I'm talking about, the problem with that approach is that it doesn't work. The problem is that all the training and preparation and so on doesn't actually prepare people for the real world in which they're going to have to operate. And the only thing you can do is to put them in the real world situation as quickly as possible, and then support them to develop the skills that they need to function in that situation. Every housing placement is different. Every work placement is different. Every social situation is different, and the skills that are required are going to be specific to that person in that situation. So where they need the training is where they've found themselves into a place, and that's when they need help, not beforehand to prepare them. And this approach is now being applied in these areas of housing and employment and social integration. And this is really the way forward. All right, fine. There's an approach with employment which is known as individual placement and support, and it begins with this notion that we must place people, we must find jobs for people first, and then help them develop the skills, and indeed help the workplace develop the right kinds of flexibility and adaptation to help them manage, rather than trying to prepare people through a series of workshops. I was involved in a study a few years ago in the north of Ireland, which was to evaluate the effectiveness of sheltered workshops at getting people back to employment. And the research was conducted by a very good research team in the University of Belfast. And they looked at the people who went through the sheltered workshops and followed them up to see how many got jobs. And they're a very good research team because they also looked at the people who dropped out, the people who gave up, and they followed them up as well. And rather embarrassingly, you're going to guess who was most successful in getting jobs. The people who are most successful in getting jobs were the people who dropped out of the workshops. Because they could see these workshops were not really going anywhere, and if they were going anywhere, they were going anywhere very slowly, and if they wanted a job, they'd be better off out of it and finding a job themselves. Now that's a kind of extreme example, but it's nevertheless, I think it's quite telling, really, about the importance of people finding a place to work and then finding out how to manage in it, but also the importance of their motivation. It was the people who were really motivated, actually, by and large, who dropped out. Anyway, this individual placement and support has been compared with traditional methods, and this is my one slide with kind of numbers and graphs on it. And you can see you don't have to be a statistician to work out that the blue bars are longer, by and large, than the dark blue bars are longer than the light blue bars. The dark blue bars show that, as it were, people going through this IPS are twice as likely to get a job and keep it than the people who go through sheltered workshops and so on. I more or less said that. Oh yeah, and it's important in these studies of individual placement with support. People did think, well, going to work is stressful. I've already said that. It is. Going to work is stressful. And so therefore, won't it mean that the people who get into jobs, they get stressed and they relapse more and go back to hospital? Well, as I said earlier, that's not the case. In fact, it's the people who don't go to work who are more likely to relapse and go back to hospital. And the other thing about this work, and I'll come back to this in a minute if I've got the time, is that once people are in work, then quite naturally they start to build up social contacts and they start to use services less. And once they use services less, then they start to cost less to the public purse. They start to give money back to society rather than use services and therefore require financial support. So in fact, these approaches are highly cost effective. They save money in the long run by helping people use the network of social supports that most of you in this room use, which don't cost society a huge amount because you're a part of it and you're giving back. Similar programs now being done with housing. It's called Housing First. It was developed in the States, and one of the early studies, very interesting study, working with people, men with severe mental health problems and also severe substance misuse problems. And what the researchers thought was, well, maybe if we find these people housing first, rather than we try and treat their mental health problems and their substance misuse problems first, that might be a better way of doing it. And sure enough, dividing the two groups randomly to one group where housing was taken as the first objective and the other group where the traditional treatment, drug anti-drugs campaigns were used. The people who got the housing first did much better in the long run, and funnily enough, without any direct and specific attention to their drug problems, they used less drugs than the people who were receiving the specific drug treatment programs. And again, it underlines the importance of these social factors in determining outcomes compared with a more traditional, rather narrow symptom-based approach. Okay. I'd like to kind of finish up now talking a little bit about stigma. Stigma appears to be a kind of global phenomenon. I've travelled quite a lot in the last few years, and I've never been to a country where there is not stigma associated with people who have mental health problems. The nature of those attitudes and what it is attached to varies a little bit from culture to culture, but stigma appears to be a kind of a universal problem. Now, when we think about stigma, we think about members of the public, out there, the employers and housing workers and maybe the police and so on, and having stigmatizing attitudes towards people with mental health problems. And that's true, by and large. However, it's not just out there it's happening. I'm afraid it's also within mental health services, and there's a very interesting review by Claire Henderson and her colleagues, which shows that there's almost as much stigma in terms of low attitudes and expectations from staff within mental health services as there is from outside. And also, and this is a problem, and I'm sure Waldo will talk about this more if you ask him later on, that the person themselves starts to stigmatize themselves. They start to internalize these ideas about, well, there's no point in me trying to get a job because I'm mentally ill and mentally ill people don't get jobs. I've heard that. So therefore, no point in me trying. And that process is known as self-stigmatization. So if you're going to tackle stigma, you can't just, as it were, tackle it out there. You also have to tackle it within mental health services, and you also have to tackle it from within the person. And we believe that's where these recovery ideas are most helpful. One of the most well-known researchers in this field is a chap called Graham Thornycroft. And he's got this model for stigma, which is based on these three elements: ignorance, prejudice, and discrimination. Ignorance is lack of information. Prejudice is the emotional reaction that goes along with that lack of information. And discrimination is the behavior that follows. And what researchers have found since Thornycroft made this distinction is that out of the three, it's the prejudice that's the really important one. And if you just give people information about what people with mental health problems, when Chantal asked me to come here, I said, well, I can't really come without bringing Waldo. I can't come without bringing somebody who has experienced mental health problems and has shown what they can do with their life. Because if I'd stood here and told you about Waldo, it would have had much less effect than Waldo standing here and telling you about himself. Because his presence here can address prejudice, because prejudice can only be addressed through contact between people who hold the prejudice and the people that they hold the prejudice about. And contact is 3 times more effective than information on its own. And I hope some of you begin to think, oh, well, if that's true, then we should be out there talking to housing, talking to staff in the services, talking to the police, because it's only through that contact that actually you can really dispel the key component of stigma. And we have a program at home, it's known as Time to Change, which is an anti-stigma program, and it's got these 3 elements, but to my mind, actually, it's not research-based as much as it should be, because it concentrates too much on information and not enough on contact. So finally, a little bit about peer support, and peer support has been around as long as people have been around who have mental health problems, which is as long as there have been people around. And this is a very nice quote, I think, from an American chap called Larry Davidson, and it's from the Enlightenment reformers in Paris. This is a colleague of Pinel, who you might have heard of. And it's there, the quote is down the bottom. He's talking about the new mental health services in late 18th century Paris. And he says, as much as possible, the servants should be chosen from the category of mental health patients. they are better suited to this demanding work because they're usually more gentle, honest, and humane. And that's Jean-Baptiste Poussin in a letter to Pinel in 1793. So, there's nothing new really in this field. But now we've got a lot of experience. Walter was talking yesterday. He was telling me yesterday there are 40 or 50 paid peer workers in his local service, and now that's not uncommon in England. People working alongside the professionals to co-produce new services. But they require preparation, they require proper recruitment and training, and then support, because it's not an easy job, it's a difficult job to do. But they can be very effective. And this is a chapter which I completed last year with my colleague Julie Repper, and we reviewed the evidence about peer support, and it shows that peer support doesn't just benefit the people directly receiving it, it also benefits the people giving it, because it makes them feel better. They've got, Waldo talked, about it transforms stigma. Waldo said it yesterday, I don't know whether you heard it, but he said, for the first time, the thing that he was most ashamed about in his life became the thing that was most important and useful. It turns stigma on its head. And it also, and now I return to where I began in a way, it also starts to affect the culture of the organisation. When staff start to see peer support working, they start to change their attitudes. It starts to tackle the stigma within mental health services amongst staff, as well as benefiting the people receiving it and benefiting the people giving it. So, 2 minutes to go. I think I'm on time here. This is a photograph of the average finance director in mental health services on a Monday morning. And he's worried about the money. Now, the thing about this work is that it begins to address some of the financial problems, because once you realise that a lot of the patients are also part of the staff, possibly, then you start to have much more resources to work with. Once you see that they don't need a lot of drugs or complicated technology, it's just them as people that can help, then you start to be able to address the problems. And as I say, the longer term evidence is that once you help people, as it were, not to use mental health services so much, you will save money, particularly if you help people keep out of hospital. The most expensive thing that a society can do is to keep people in hospital for long periods of time. Once you can start to reduce, not necessarily eliminate, but reduce the amount of time people spend in hospital, then you're going to save money. And there was a review done a couple of years ago now by a group of health economists at the London School of Economics, which says that an approach which may also in time offer the biggest scope for cost savings is to promote and expand co-production, drawing on the resources of people who are currently using mental health services. So, better and cheaper. Who could possibly resist that? But in the end, it is all about people. And you can see in the cartoon here, it says, well, 1 out of 4 people in this country is mentally unbalanced. That's what the figures tend to suggest. 1 in 4 a year will consult their GP with mental health problems. So think of your 3 closest friends. If they seem to be all right, well, it must be you. And there's an important message here, because it is you. We all have our experiences of recovery. Nearly all of us in our lives will experience times when our level of mental distress constitutes a sufficient degree of severity to be recognised as such by a research instrument. Everybody in this room, I won't ask you to put your hands up, but everybody in this room has experienced recovery from mental health problems. People have different degrees of severity and it happens in different contexts, of course, but we all have that experience. And the problem for mental health services is that they're built around a notion of difference, that the staff are different. They're so clever and they're so knowledgeable that they, recovery doesn't apply to them. Well, we've done a lot of work with staff, and once you open the door, staff just want to talk about their own recovery and their own recovery experiences, and we want to try to help them apply those to working, with people who are actually using mental health services because of the severity of their experiences. And so it's very important that we recognise what we have in common rather than what we have, as it were, in difference, and that we listen and respect our fellow human beings and their experiences and their expertise and bring them in alongside mental health professionals in order to make better lives for them. Thank you very much.